We'll be moving on. I'll, of course, be getting in today talking about the early history of like Roman history, kind of like the background of it, and we'll get into like the Republican period probably of the Roman state, which develops in the Iron Age. Yeah, today, like I said, I'm going to talk about mostly the background of ancient Greece, talk about how it started more or less in Italy. I'll get into that, and then I'll get into like the monarchy. I'll talk a little bit about the monarchy. I guess they had the regal period of Rome. And then I'll talk about of course, the Republic. That's the main thing we'll probably talk about this week overall. So as you can see there, we'll cover the early, history of Rome with, from really the 8th century down to the time of like Julius Caesar. I think that's most of the stuff we'll probably get to maybe this week overall. But so anyway, let's kind of talk about the Romans first, kind of get into some background. By the way, here's the link to StreamYard. I don't know if anybody wants to join me in StreamYard.com, but there it is right there that I sent out to y'all already. But yeah, what was the ancient Roman civilization? Well, it's an ancient civilization that, of course, one of the most famous that occurred in the Iron Age. I think you had the Greeks, the Persians, and the Romans were your three first big Iron Age civilizations. I got a definition for you I can put on the screen for you, but basically it was a type of, obviously, European state that it started out as in mostly ancient Italy. You can see developed in the Iron Age, roughly about 2,800 years ago, and over time it grew, into this massive state, massive empire, which eventually would control multiple continents. In fact, it would eventually, at one point, control, at least part of 3 continents, which you can see, which, North Africa, of course, he controlled that good chunk of Europe, minus, say, Germany. You went up to Spain, France, Italy, Greece, Britain were the main areas that, of course, they controlled. You can see they also controlled part of southwestern Asia, like Turkey, Syria, all the way into Iraq at one point. And I think there's even a theory that they did reach at one point the Caspian Sea. Oh, and also the northern part of the Black Sea. They may have also, where the Crimea is today, they may have actually went up in there also as well. So this empire was massive. It was the largest empire in ancient times, like in antiquity, peaking somewhere between 2 to 3 million square miles. I think in the video they mentioned about 117 AD or CE as the year when the empire peaked in size and then started shrinking down. And you can see it was around for a long time. It was, around for close to 1,200 years, at least the empire itself, the main one you're looking at, was there about that time. Over time, it fell apart. It declined in size. It broke up. And then what happened was they had this other empire later you may have heard of called the Byzantine Empire or Eastern Roman Empire that kind of survived from that time into the Middle Ages. And it's around, at least remnants of it, is around up until like 1453 before it's conquered by the Ottoman Empire. Of course, Constantinople, it's now called Istanbul. And Rome would actually decline in power as a city, which it was the capital of the empire for years. So I'm going to kind of get into a little background, of course, about the modern state, of course, of Rome. If you go back to the map here, mostly Rome develops in northern Italy. It looks like it's on the coast, but it's actually not. It's more into the central part of Italy today. And it's based around a famous river, which I'm sure you've heard about, called the Tiber. It's probably the most famous river in Italy I can think of, like maybe the Po River Valley and maybe the Rubicon as well. But they believe that Rome itself was founded sometime in the 8th century. I know the popular date that they put the Roman civilization beginning, similar to the Greeks, is close to that same date. Theirs is 776. Well, Romans is 753 BC. That's the traditional date that they usually put it, like in the Christian calendar later, which that you're using there. And they say a long time ago that the Romans used to count back, to the founding of the city. Which I'll get to the founders, Romulus and Remus, that would help found the city eventually. And they believe that Rome was founded around 7 hills. I've got them on there. I can give you the list of them right there. The most famous is the Palatine Hill, just the first one in the list, but you can see all the other ones: Capitoline Hill, Aventine Hill, Esquiline, Celian, Quirinial, Viminal Hill. Those are all the ones that, of course, that were based around Rome. And it's believed that the Palatine, that one right there, of course, was the one where the city first was founded initially. Then it spread out among those other hills, which most of Rome was built around that up to modern times, of course, overall. A lot of the oldest aspects of Rome are close to the Palatine Hill, where the Roman Forum is right next to it. Rome did have founders. I think you may have heard about these twins that were, of course, well known in Roman history, which I'll show you kind of a statue of them right here, which is Romulus and Remus. Of course, the Romans believed that they were descended from gods. There's the famous Capitoline wolf that they usually called it, the she-wolf that supposedly saved the two twins, which I'll get to that story a little later. But the story of Romulus and Remus, they were actually the grandsons of a king of ancient Italy, a man named Numitor. He was a king of a city-state called Alba Longa, which was one of the earliest ancient states that was in Italy that went back to the Iron Age. The original Romans were related back to a people that were called the Latins, the Latin peoples. Anyway, there's a legend where, if you know about this, they had a mother put on the screen. Her name was Rhea Silvia, and she was raped by the god Mars. And of course, the belief was the Romans believed that basically that they were descended from gods, and so Romulus and Remus were believed to be these demigods in Roman mythology, which a lot of that's probably made up, about Romulus and all that, and his brother Remus. But it's a story that the Romans believed, going back, hundreds of thousands of years. And anyway, supposedly in the story, there was a brother of Numitor. His name was Emilius. You see there, Emilius. He tried to steal the throne from Numitor, had him in prison, took his throne, and he took the two boys, the grandsons, basically his two nephews, and he put them in a basket and floated them on the Nile. On the Tiber, like the Nile. It's kind of like the story of the Nile and Moses, I guess. Kind of similar to that, isn't it? Kind of seems like it. But yeah, took them on the Tiber and thought they would drown. And of course, what ended up happening, there was a she-wolf that found them, as you see in the picture right here. Supposedly in the legend, that was found by him. And they were able to suckle off her teats to I guess, survive for a while. Before they died. And supposedly there was one of the king's shepherd, his name was Faustulus, eventually saved the two twins. So it was considered a miracle. And so that's something that later on the Romans would, basically build statues like that, like the so-called Capitoline wolf that you're looking at with that. Usually they just have the wolf without the two boys, I think, but they later added that later, more or less. What happened later, the twins, Romulus and Remus, later overthrew Emilius. They basically put their grandfather back in power, Numitor. He became the king again of Alba Longa. And then what happened was they then went on to found their own city, of course, which was, basically what would be Rome. So that's basically, more or less the story of Romulus and Remus and all that. Now, what happened over time, if you know about, the story of Romulus and Remus, it's kind of like Cain and Abel, in the Bible. I heard about that story, how Cain killed Abel. Well, guess what? Yeah, that's what happened. Romulus later killed Remus, which is true about that. And the two apparently disputed over basically the construction of the city, which I think was mostly of the fortification of it. And Remus was kind of making fun of Romulus about him building a wall around his city. Romulus got mad and killed him. And so after that, what ended up happening, of course, was the city of Rome ended up being named after, of course, Romulus. And, of course, the name Romans later. So that's how the name came about and all that. And so I guess if Remus would have killed Romulus, they would have been called it Reme or Rema, or I guess they would have been the Remans, which wouldn't have sounded as good, I guess, as Romans, more or less. Romulus, by the way, became one of the first of the seven. There were 7 kings that the Romans had, so-called regal period, as they called it, which I think goes from 753 to about 510 BC is the years. That's the years he reigned as king. And they call it different names. I think usually people call it the monarchy of the Romans or the regal period of the Romans. The Romans, apparently, when they founded the city, like under Romulus, they didn't have a whole lot of people. That was one of the problems that they had. And I don't know if you know what happened was they had to go out and get a bunch of women to help populate it. And that later led to the so-called, they actually call it different names. I think they later call it the rape of the Sabine women, I think is one of the common names that they usually call it, where he seized a bunch of Italic tribes, like in their women predominantly. And it was later called the Roman Sabine Wars. I think they sometimes nickname it. And there had been a lot of paintings made of this before. Like the most famous one is done by Jacques Louis David, who you see in there. He's done a lot of historical paintings like the death of Socrates and all that. He's done a lot of paintings, of course, on the French Revolution. And he's got a lot of paintings on Napoleon, like Napoleon crossing the Alps. You may have seen that painting before. And so yeah, that's how they were able to populate, the Roman state by, bringing other peoples in. But the Romans will eventually conquer a lot of the other cities or city-states that are kind of around that area that's around the Tiber. Like Alba Longa will kind of be absorbed into the Roman state, eventually. So this is going to take a couple centuries, but eventually the Romans are going to populate and take over all of Italy. Now, I want to also talk about some of the famous authors that are kind of well known that dealt with early Roman history. One of the most famous is a writer named, they call him Titus Livius. Here's, of course, the ones on the bottom. Those are the big ones, I guess, that kind of go into the early history of the Romans. These are ancient writers that go back to that time. Titus Livius is just called Livy for short in the West. That's the short name they usually call him. He's Roman. Plutarch was Greek writer, living about 1900 years ago. And then Virgil was a famous Roman poet. He was pretty big as well. And here, of course, is Livy. Livy wrote a series of books. I'll put it on the screen, but it was called originally, they call it today the History of Rome. That's what everybody calls it, now. But you can see that it had an original name that it was called, which was Ab Urbe Condite. And sometimes Condite Libre, they'll say, which means books. That Libre means books in Latin. Books from the founding of the city. So this particular series of books that he wrote, Livy, which were completed, by the way, 9 BC. I think it took him like something around 20 years or so to write these. This is a massive work he wrote, huge. I don't know, this guy was crazy with his writing, but it was enormous historical work. One of the best ever done, probably on Roman history, although he kind of tends to romanticize, some of the things about Rome, of course, like a lot of them do anyway. And only 35 of the 142 books are still around. So like 1/4 or 25% or so still exist today. It's the only, I guess, the only sad thing about that, more or less. But the early history, like the first 5 books, are really important because it goes into like the early monarchs of Rome and also the Republic. But he does have other stuff too, like he goes into like not just the monarchy, but he goes into the Roman Republic, like all the famous people, the Republic, and Of course, Levy's real big in like writing about the Punic Wars. That's one thing he's, of course, known for. So he, like all the information about Hannibal, like the famous Carthaginian general when the Romans fight him in the Second Punic War, he's pretty much the main source on all those wars overall. Other two famous writers that were big, that kind of give some early history of Rome. I guess I'll mention Plutarch first. I guess I'll talk about him. Let me talk about him first, of course, on the left. Plutarch was this Greek writer we've talked about before, who lived about 1900 years ago, something like almost 2,000 years ago, roughly. And he wrote a series of biographies about famous Greek and Roman peoples, which are called different names. They usually call it the so-called parallel lives. Basically, he would compare like a Greek famous person to a Roman famous person. Like he compared Alexander the Great to Julius Caesar because both were like great conquerors, more or less. So you get a lot of information about the Romans, like famous people, because of Plutarch. He's more of a biographer, and he also wrote about the Spartans. There's a lot of extensive history of the Spartans and all that. Yeah, here's some examples of some of the biographies. Like Romulus, Scipio Africanus was a great general, the rival general to Hannibal. Cato the Younger, and the Elder. So both those are famous Roman people. Sulla, I heard of him. Marius, Crassus, Brutus, Pompey, Julius Caesar. Those are all famous dictators in Rome later, of course. Also, Cicero and Mark Antony. Like if you want to look up stuff about Mark Antony, and Cleopatra, as well. Of course, he's a big source on that. So yeah. He's a pretty important source on Roman history, more or less. Also, then I guess I'll talk about also Virgil, who you see there as well in that picture right there. Virgil is a very famous Roman poet that lived around the same time as Emperor Augustus. So he lived close to about 2,000 years ago as well. He wrote a famous book that's called the Aeneid, which is really an epic poem. And it tells the story like the period after the Trojan War. It's kind of continuing the sagas of the Trojan War that Homer had began a long time ago. And it talks about Aeneas. Aeneas was this Trojan refugee that survived the sack of Troy. Anyway, a little about Aeneas. Aeneas was actually related to King Priam. He was like a second cousin. And he was famous for exploring the Mediterranean Sea. Like he settled in Italy, they believe. There's also a side story I'll tell you about too, where he supposedly visited Carthage and actually was a lover of Queen Dido, who basically founded Carthage a long time ago. But he left her, if you know about this, and he went to Italy. And from there, he began founding cities in what is Italy. And some of these cities, of course, became, like famous, like Alba Longa, which were believed to be where Romulus and Remus were descended from, going back to, of course, that King Numitor and Rhea Silvia, their mother. So that's basically the story of, Romulus and Remus and their connection to Aeneas. And so, yeah, the Virgil, like a lot of the Romans, thought that they were related back to the Trojans, or part god, not just, I guess, related to, Mars, but also, Aphrodite. Remember Aphrodite or Venus was the lover of, Mars and all that. So, yeah, because you understand that whole thing. But they're not sure that's really true or not. I know that's kind of something that people talk about sometimes, more or less. But they think that the Romans were like a mix of peoples, not just Latin peoples that lived in, Italy, but yeah, the Etruscans that were in the north, the Greeks in the south, like in southern Italy and also Sicily. And so, yeah, the Romans were obviously a mix of different European peoples. It could be possible that the Trojans, some of them could have settled there. They got sacked, but I don't know if that's really true about that. Time period of that's kind of kind of a bigger gap too, because the Trojan War happened maybe closer to 1200. Rome wasn't founded until later, so I'm not sure about that one. So it's something to think about, but maybe. All right, so let me go ahead and move on. Of course, I'm going to get more into the Roman state, of course, and talk more about its background and history. Of course, we're going to get more into the Roman Republic that will eventually form, and before it happened, of course, talk a little about the Roman, like the early state. They believe the Roman state developed from a confederation of states, which were called different names. I think sometimes they call it the Latin League was one of the nicknames they called it. And remember, there was like that area called Latium that was kind of around Italy, hence the name came from. But I believe the term Latin derived from a king, like an ancestor of the Romans named Latium, or actually Latinus, I think was his name actually. And so the origin of the name and the language kind of evolved, of course, from that, which they think Latin was a type of language that was probably influenced from like the Greeks and the Phoenicians. So they would develop around the Tiber River. It's believed that the Roman state, at least the kingdom itself, after it was founded by Romulus, was actually a mixture of peoples, like the Sabines I told you about. Then the Etruscans that were in the north, they came in also as well and became very powerful. Who were the Etruscans? The Etruscans were like ancient peoples of northern Italy. They actually went back further than the Latin peoples. I want to say close to 1200 BC. So it's like before the founding of Rome. And they lived in the Po River Valley, which is like up there in northern Italy where Tuscany is today. Turin, you ever at Turin and all those areas, cities up there in the north, or Torino, I think is the Italian name they call it as well. And it's believed that the Etruscans were a civilization that was more advanced than the Latin peoples of the time, and they think that a lot of their culture was influential on the Romans. Actually, I think their language was kind of a mix of Phoenician and maybe Etruscan. I think some Greek influences later as well. But the Romans later called that area Etruria, where the Etruscans were and all that. And a lot of the kings of Rome, a lot of them were Etruscan, especially the last few of them that ruled down to close to 510 BC. So yeah, the Etruscans had a big influence. I think they see even like the idea like aqueducts, the gladiatorial type events and things the Romans are known for later were really Etruscan ideas that you have later. Oh, by the way, the Roman kings did have supreme royal power. That is one thing that they're known for. They talk about the idea of imperium, which is this idea where one magistrate or ruler that's in power has authority over others, like over civilians, over the soldiers and the military. And the word imperium either means to command, or I think another translation is the power to command is usually the translation. And one thing that is very famous about the Romans that you probably have heard about, the Romans had this famous symbol that's well known called the fasci, which has been around for thousands of years. And the fasci is a type of Roman symbol that was a symbol of power and authority, of like the rulers. Troops would sometimes even carry it in battle and all that. And the fasci is a term that means, by the way, in Latin, it means bundle. That's what it means. Yeah, bundle. Or some people say bundle of rods. It's a bundle of rods with an axe coming out of it. It may have been used to execute people too. Imagine. It's almost like a weapon. And you see it a lot, not just through Roman times, but you see it up through modern times. As you know, the term fascist or fascism, derived from it originally. You remember, you've probably heard about Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, who developed later in the early 20th century. They would actually use the fasci as a symbol of their right-wing movements, which was a form of totalitarianism that became real popular. And so that's the origins of where the term fascist or fascism came from. Just recently, 100 years ago or whatever. So I think Mussolini was the one that first developed it. because he was trying to revitalize Italy to be like modern Italy, to be more like the Roman Empire from a long time ago, and that's the reason why he did it. By the way, the Romans, like the original monarchs, had these like advisory body, which was later called the Roman Senate, and it was mostly comprised of like nobility that would advise the king on political, military issues. And then what happened was over time it grew into a main political institution of Rome, which was like its main, one of its main governing bodies, and also its main body that would advise like the magistrates and the rulers later, advise emperors, things like that. And at least up to the Republic, it was a very powerful. And then by the time the empire came in, it became more of a rubber stamp. It became more weaker over time. And as you know, the Roman Empire, the emperors became more authoritarian. All right, so just kind of some background on Rome. I'll come back and talk about their government a little later, but the Republic itself is run a lot by a lot of chief magistrates, kind of like the Greeks we talked about before. All right, let me get into next and talk about how the Romans ended up becoming a republic. They would go from being a monarchy to a republic. And there was an incident that happened that's kind of famous I'll talk about today for the Romans. But 509 BC, the Romans convert over to the Roman Republic, a republican state, around the year 509. That's actually overthrew one of their last Etruscan rulers that reigned, Tarquin Superbus. They call it, by the way, Tarquin the Proud. And it was kind of like a revolution. It was like a political revolution, which it was. And it was an incident you see there called the Rape of Lucretia that happened, they think, in 510, they think is the year when it occurred. And Lucretia was this Roman noblewoman. I'm pronounced Lucretia, I think, also as well. And she apparently was raped or assaulted sexually by one of the king's sons. His name was Sextus Tarquinius. I always like that name, Sextus. It's kind of ironic, I guess. And the term rape, by the way, I think I've kind of talked about the rape of Sabines and all that. It's a term that's been around, which goes back to really, Roman times. The word rape actually means to seize, because, a long time ago when, I guess, one state would attack another and defeat it or whatever, it would seize their women, take their women, more or less. So I guess he was trying to she was married to somebody else. And so that assault, apparently, she killed herself. If you know about that, committed suicide afterwards. And her uncle, whose name was, by the way, Lucius Junius Brutus, one of those famous Brutuses in history you probably heard about, eventually led a revolution, which overthrew basically the actual monarchy. In fact, I think the actual son was like, I think, one of his nephews. Yeah, the guy has a nephew that actually raped her, and so basically he ends up founding this state in 509 BC. And one thing that Brutus is well known for, if you know about it, Brutus is famous for an oath where he said basically that Rome, from now on, would never have a king. It was one of the things that they promised to do. And that's something like, if ever somebody tried to do that, they would have them murdered. If you know about that, kill them off, basically. So that incident, I guess, changed the course of, Roman history at that point. And I'll get to it later, but the Roman state later is called sometimes SPQR, which is Senatus Populus Romanus. Of course, that's what they usually call it, basically. I'll get to that a little bit later, why they call it that. So yeah, the Roman state, the term republic is actually, the origin of it comes from two Latin words, res and publica, which there's different translations of it, but it can mean commonwealth, or you can see public or people's affairs. That's kind of what it means, more or less. And the Roman Republic is considered one of the first major types of states that was based on what we call representative democracy, which is basically it was like a democracy, kind of like the Greeks. But the only thing about their state was that it was more like an oligarchy. The fact that a lot of the upper class elites controlled most of the power. And it's pretty much like that throughout a lot of the Roman history that comes later. And the Roman Republic is considered one of the longest lasting republics in history. It's lasted, you see there, I think I said close to 488 years that it lasted. That's a long time. That's, kind of around almost 500 years. That's a long time period. And I think ours is not quite there. We're supposed to be halfway through there or more. So we're over 200 something years right now, get closer to 300. And so I don't know, maybe we'll make it one day, that far. But their republic starts, I think by the end of it, starts declining. I'll get to later, and eventually it becomes more of an empire eventually. Now, the ancient Roman state, like I said, was called SPQR, which was really that they called the government of Rome, not really the state itself, but they do use that name for like the republic and the empire in the future. But yeah, Senatus Populus Romanus, shortened into initials there, SPQR, means the Senate and the Roman people. You can see where they get it from. They get the SPQR. The S comes from the beginning of Senatus. You can see right here. P and then the Q's over here. This really probably should be really almost like two words. And then, of course, Romanus also right there. So SPQR. You can see there's no initials to it. Back then, they didn't have punctuation. So it's not like USA with periods or something like that. It would be. They didn't chant it, I don't think, as far as I know. SPQR, I don't think so. But they would put it on buildings. They would put it on standards. Usually on buildings, it would be spelled out. And then maybe on standards, I guess they would have to shorten it more or less. So like legions might have it on there also as well, that they carry it to battle and things like that. Now, this state we're talking about, the Roman Republic, especially the Republic, not so much the empire, but the Republic was divided into different social classes, which I kind of wanted to go through and talk about today. The highest class they had was the aristocracy, which would be considered like the so-called upper class of Rome, the people that founded the state a long time ago. Patricians were believed to be descended from Romulus and Remus. In fact, the term patrician is derived from the word pater, which means father in Latin. You may have heard the term mater, which means mother, in Latin, like maternity. You have mother, so you get the term mother from that, mater. So pater and mater. Patricians, of course, were called sometimes the senatorial class because they controlled the Roman Senate. They had all the power. You can see they had all the money, the land. A lot of them were the main generals in the armies and stuff like that. So they pretty much made up a minority of the people, but they had all the power. You control over everything in Rome. This for a long time, of course. Also, there's a one that's kind of between, like I'll kind of talk about that I want to mention too, the equestrian class. People forget about them. They're called the equites or knights. Equit just means knight or cavalryman. These were kind of like an upper middle class that's between the patricians and what they call the plebeians below them. And they're kind of also considered part of the senatorial class as well. They came out of the Roman cavalry primarily, and they're kind of a wealthy business class. Some of them even become emperors, later in the future from that class. So that's another one that's kind of like almost like an upper class. So like almost they had two upper classes in a sense, right there. Then you got your plebeians, the common people, commoners, of course, which were called plebes for short. And these mostly were peasants. They were primarily farmers, throughout the Republic. And they didn't have as much equality with the upper classes. So they had less power, less money, and so on. They made the bulk of the people that were in the Roman armies, like the legionnaires, the soldiers, and all that. And I guess a lot of the people that were like, equestrian or patrician were pretty much in the like officers, in the military, the generals, that led the legions and things like that. Other people that were in the state too, women, of course, did not have equality to men. That's something you can forget about in Greek Roman times. The men were the head of the household, what they call paterfamilia. You may have heard that term being used before. Only men could basically inherit wealth, inherit land titles, things like that. And so quite often, like if you didn't have a son, one of the things the Romans would do, which was very famous, they would adopt somebody. They might have a nephew or something like, I guess Julius Caesar had. Remember, Julius Caesar adopted Octavian as his son. I think it was grandnephew. And so he would do that, basically. You wanted to, somebody inherit, people inherit, somebody inherit something, I guess, that you owned. Then, of course, they had slaves. Don't forget, most of Rome was like the Roman state, Republic Empire was built off of slaves, which is true about that. Varies on the amount. Like I got 1/3 to 1/4 the actual population, but most of like the Roman state, like buildings or roads or whatever you look at, like in Italy or wherever else you see Roman, monuments still left behind, were all built on slave labor. I think the only thing I could think of that was not was Hadrian's Wall, built up in northern Britain. And so, that's something that they're known for. And of course, they got this huge slave population from all the conquests as the Roman state expanded throughout, the Mediterranean world. Also, the social classes also have their own assemblies. I did want to mention that too, as well. The Romans called their assemblies a consul, just like the Greeks did, by the way, like a bulle, I guess what the Greek term was, I know. But patricians, equites, they had the Roman Senate. So that was the so-called senatorial class. They cared more about wealthy people and wealthy matters, things of the state. And they had a lot of power because of that Roman Senate, as you know. Then the plebes later had their own assembly, of course, which was called it's got all kinds, the plebeian consul, the people's consul, popular consul. It's got all kinds of names. It was called. And the plebeian consul was more based off of the plebes trying to protect their rights, property, and things like that. They had these people called tribunes of the plebes they had that would also do that as well. I'll get to them later. They had other ones too, other assemblies. They had the tribal consul, which the Romans, like the Greeks, they divided themselves into Roman tribes. And they also had this thing called the centuriate consul, which also was for the Roman military. So they had an assembly for that. I think they had a fifth one too, or something. They had, I know, at least 5 of them I know that they had. But they had numerous ones, kind of like the Greeks had more than one. Like Athens had at least 2 major ones that they had. Let me also talk about, of course, they have what they call magistrates that would run the Roman state. I need to talk about that also as well. The highest magistrate the Romans had was a consul. Most of these were magistrates that were either elected or appointed to the Roman state. What I mean by, appointed is that later when the emperor, comes in, he'll appoint them. But under the Republic, a lot of times they'd have elections to be, into that position. Roman consuls, there were 2 of them. 2 Roman consuls that would serve 1-year terms. There was a minimum age. Of course, I'll get you later about that. But Roman consuls, they could enact laws. They could act as judges, like in the Roman court system. So they dealt with law, things like that and judicial stuff. They commanded troops in battle. That's one thing they're known for being famous, for being like generals, leading legions in battle. They're elected by the male citizens, of course. And there had that one thing about the Roman consul, which is very famous. They were known for having this power called veto, where they could veto like another magistrate, or they could veto like some kind of law. So the word veto means, by the way, I forbid. And of course, it's used today, as you know, modern times, like like our government, you have governors and presidents that'll veto like a law or a bill. They had a minimum age, I think around 40 is the minimum age. And so before you could oftentimes become consul, they would want you to have some kind of military political experiences. So Romans had something called a cursus honorum, or honorable course, where you would have to start at the bottom, like lower magistrates, and work your way up to the top. So that was done to get experience, but also to prevent, I guess, corruption in the Roman government. These are other magistrates I'll put on the screen that were very famous. Quaestor, of course, they got the aedile, the praetor. I mentioned that one, the praetor. So another that was big. That's usually the order of it. Like to get to consul, you had to start on the bottom as a treasury official and work your way to the top to get to being like a Roman consul. And so the quaestor was like this treasury official that ran dealt with money, like the Roman money, taxes, and things like that. Ran the treasury, and minimum age was 30, or you could run office. So you have to start at the bottom at a younger age. Lower magistrate, of course, you can see position. Aedile was a type of public works official. They mostly would run like the temples. They would put on the public games. Like if you wonder who would run like the Circus Maximus or put on the gladiatorial events in the Colosseum, that would be it. So I think they're varied on how many of them were, but after the empire, there were like 4 or 5 of them, I know, at one point that did all that. 36 minimum age, you can see, lower magistrate position. Praetor, of course, was one of the higher magistrate positions, which was like a type of legal official that dealt with law, judicial stuff. You can see they had to be 39. Praetor could also lead troops in battle. They think that was the origin of where the consul came from over time, more or less. There's another position that was also pretty big as a magistrate. It was an upper magistrative position in the government called the censor, which there are only 2 of them. They're elected to 5-year terms. And they dealt with all kinds of things. The so-called Roman census, which was done every 5 years. And the census was a head count where they would count the amount of population of the citizenship to kind of figure out taxes and how many people are in the Roman state, more or less. If you ever read the Bible, Jesus, and all that, his family going to, of course, Jerusalem and all that, and they talk about the census at the time. That's why they went there. Public works, they built like buildings, like public work buildings. They built roads, they built bridges. It was something the censor was known for. They also dealt with public morality, like so they could crack down on things that they thought was lewd, and so on. So censor was pretty big, in Rome, if you study about it. And I think we'll talk about one of the Catos. I think, was it Cato the Younger or one of those Catos? It's called sometimes Cato the Censor or something like that. So it was a pretty prestigious position, the censor, if you're elected to it. They did have a Roman high priest, which by the way was an elected position, so-called Pontifex Maximus. Actually, I think is the name. Great priest, I think is what it meant. And they would plan the Roman calendar of like the religious stuff. And it was like the highest official they had in the religions of Rome. This poor Christianity came along. But over time, the Pope, the Catholic Church, would actually adopt the title. Pontifex is used also as well, believe it or not. That's where it actually originated from, like from a long time ago. I always mention the Roman high priest because that's supposedly the famous position that Julius Caesar was elected to. His first position, he ran for office and won. And they work with the Vestal Virgins and all that other thing. That's kind of a cool job, Vestal Virgins. Then you have the tribune. The tribune was like this plebeian magistrate that was elected for like 1-year terms, which there were 10 of them. They were elected every year. And they were involved in protecting the plebes and their rights, their property later. And they're around up to like the 2nd century BC. But I think up to the time of the dictator Sulla, he kind of like forced them out and they weren't as powerful later. But they're around up to like the 2nd century, more or less. Hey, Jazel. Good morning. Anyway, so yeah, that's of course some of the famous different magistrates that ran the state. They also had this thing called the conflict of the orders that broke out around the 5th century. If you know about the Romans, the social orders were kind of divided, and basically the patricians, like the upper classes, barred a lot of the plebes, like the lower class, from having any political rights, power, like in the military, even religion. And so what happened was in the 5th century, the plebes basically started this open conflict with the upper classes. It was called the conflict of the orders, or sometimes called the struggle of the orders. And it started with the so-called plebe strike. You know about this, where the plebes decided they weren't going to serve in the military anymore. And so over time, it got to the point where the patricians were forced to give them more equality. And so one of the things that happened was the plebes were given like the right to their own assembly. Is one thing that occurs. So-called plebeian council forms. They even get their own magistrates, like the plebeian tribunes I told you about as well. And then they even got rid of like one thing that had been big, where a lot of plebes had been going into like slavery because they owed money. Enslavement for debt was ended, believe it or not. They also have like child slavery sometimes, where you have to sell your children into slavery to make up for money. Kind of sad, but yeah, they would do that. They also laxed a lot of the marriage laws, and plebes and patricians could actually marry, because prior to that, those main two social classes were kind of segregated from each other, more or less. To settle disputes, one thing that happened afterwards, they think in that same 5th century, was the so-called 12 tables or 12 tablets was created in Rome, which were these written law codes that basically were initially created to settle disputes between the plebes and the patricians, because they're kind of at each other's throats. And the term 12 tables actually means 12 tablets, because it was written on 12 tablets. And it's kind of like the Romans 10 commandments, except it's 12 tablets instead of 2. And anyway, it became this civil criminal law code that became the basis of the Roman Constitution, that would basically protect, all the rights of citizens, like plebes, patricians, etc., protect the property rights and so on, which obviously women, slaves didn't have as much rights, under these laws, but that's kind of like it was in the Greek world, also as well. So that's the initial how, they start developing the Roman state, the government, a lot of their laws, their courts, things like that were developed pretty much by the 5th century, that they've kind of done all this overall. For a few minutes, let me also talk about, of course, the famous Roman forum that they have also as well. There, of course, is the Palatine Hill that you're kind of looking at right here. So yeah, that's supposedly the oldest part of Rome you're looking at right there. And originally they had like some palaces built here. I think Augustus' palace was originally here, but this is like the time of going back to the time of maybe like around Nero's time, that palace. But Rome itself, of course, had the famous Roman Forum that was there. Yeah, there you go, the Palace of Tiberius Caligula. So yeah, it's about the time period we're talking about, close to Nero's time. But yeah, the Roman Forum, of course, became very, very famous, of course, with the Romans. It was not built in a day. That's one thing that's very famous, about the Roman Forum. It's kind of the old joke about Rome, that it took many, many centuries for it to be developed. Rome itself was actually built by numerous people, like politicians, emperors that came later. The Romans itself called it different names. The Forum Magnum is one of the common names that they would sometimes call the Forum, which meant great forum, basically. And then some of it is called forum, for short, is what they would call it. And what was it? It was like a town square, plaza, if you want to call it, where basically it was the center of Roman life in general. So that's started as a marketplace, they think, and then over time they put public buildings around it, baths, temples, entertainment. It was within walking distance. Obviously, people lived in houses or apartments that were around it also as well. You can also see behind me the Colosseum, which is way back here behind it. The Circus Maximus is also within walking distance also as well. Yeah, back in those days, people could, meet each other. Oftentimes, Julius Caesar might meet some other people that are lower classes there. So it's a chance for different peoples to meet there and so on. I know the baths were like real big. They built like multiple baths, like up to the time at Caracalla, were built pretty much there. Most of it is in ruins, which a lot of that was due to like wars. I know up to like Justinian's time, it was wrecked. I know that because of wars. And so, yeah, about 4 to 5 million people go there today, like to Rome as tourists, basically. So I don't know how it is going on during the pandemic, probably less now than it was before. But it's obviously something that's very famous that most people go see. Colosseum, of course, one of the most famous that people like to go see the most. And most cities, by the way, had some kind of forum. Like you can go to Pompeii, also in Italy, Naples, and they had some kind of forum as well. As you can go and visit that city as well. All right, I've got a few minutes left, not much. I'm going to go ahead and also just a little bit today. So here's kind of the picture right there, but I want to talk a little bit about the Punic Wars, like just a background on it today, because I'll kind of be getting more into that later, more or less into the week, talking about the later part of the Republic. And what were the Punic Wars? The Punic Wars were these series of wars that broke out between Rome and Carthage, which those two states at the time, of course, were the Roman Republic, which was based in Italy. And, of course, you had the Carthaginian Empire, which was based mostly in North Africa, which I have a map of it right here to show you. You can see, most of Rome was in Italy at the time when the wars broke out. And then you can see Carthage was a much larger empire. It, of course, was in North Africa primarily, but you can see it was in Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Elba, maybe right here, and also part of Spain. So it's a massive state, which actually at the time I think was more powerful than the Roman state that was there. And I think I may have talked about the Carthaginians before, but I remember correctly, they were founded by the Phoenicians, like a long time ago. Just before we were talking about the Phoenicians. And it's believed that it was founded by a woman. It's true. Queen Dido, who came from Phoenicia, and she bought the first land there. And the state was founded, they believe, where what would be today the modern state of Tunisia, which Tunisia, by the way, I'll show you in this map, is located about halfway in the Mediterranean Sea, across from where Sicily is. So Tunisia is like right here. It says Carthage, so you got Sicily right here. So yeah, that's where she came. She came here, and she basically founded the state and bought some land there. Suppose that love affair I told you about, Dido, if you know about that, met, Aeneas, and I think they were supposed to marry, but I think he left her. I think she killed herself, I think, later. But yeah, that's where they would found the actual capital of the Carthaginian Empire, which is where the ruins of Tunis is, which is the capital of Tunisia, which, as you know, the capital of the city of Carthage was later destroyed by the Romans in the 2nd century BC. We'll get to that later. But a little bit about Carthage. It was a vast trading empire, which traded throughout the Mediterranean Sea, North Africa, Spain, Italy. It's believed that also Carthage, which had a very strong naval power, even explored into the Atlantic Ocean. There's theories that they went all the way up to maybe Britain. I heard a theory that they even may have gone down to the tip of Africa, that far south, the Carthaginians. Another theory I've heard is that they even may have gone to America. They found America like a long time ago. I think there's theories they may have found sometime artifacts or something in America that prove that the Carthaginians may have been there, but they're not sure about that, if that's true or not. So the time, when the Punic Wars break out, you're going to have, you got Rome, which is, got the big military power, land armies. And then, of course, the Carthaginians had more of their naval power. So it's kind of the two sides that kind of fight it out, of course, later. The Romans knew the Carthaginians were related to the Phoenicians, although the Carthaginian state is a multinational state. It's made up of peoples. You see that map there, the so-called Numidians, which are right here. Yeah, they're kind of part of it. They kind of joined it. They had Libyans that were part of it. People that are African, they're part of it. Hispanic peoples. Now, I think the Celts, like up in France, Italy, joined them also as well. So you had different kinds of peoples that made up the Carthaginian Empire. But yeah, the Romans knew they went back to the Carthaginians, so-called purple people or Phoenicians. And so they often would call them either from the name Punicus or Punici. That's where the term Punic came from. And so the term Punic Wars meant the Phoenician Wars. So that's hence why they call them that. And I'll get more into the wars, later in the week. But, the wars are told from the Roman perspective. I told you about Titus Livy. He wrote one of the main works about the wars. I think there's another guy named Polybius, I think was also famous, was another writer. But all the wars are written from the Roman perspective because of the fact that the Romans, eventually destroy the Carthaginian Empire. It's wiped out and they conquer their territory. And I'll get more into later in the week how this leads to the beginning of the Roman Empire. That's going to start expanding from the Republic. And so that's what I'm going to get more into, of course, more on Thursday, of course. Excuse me, on Wednesday later in the week. So anyway, that's pretty much it lecture-wise today. If you have any questions, remember, if you have any questions about the lecture, don't forget to send me any comments, questions, of course, later. Don't look like anybody has any live. But don't forget, I did have that assignment I had that was, out right now. I think on China, it's still up. So it's going to expire tonight. So don't forget about trying to complete that. I have been sending out a lot of messages about that. So try to get that out of the way because you got the second exam you got to start working on to try to get that out of the way. Because, spring break's coming up. We have a shorter week this week. Friday, of course, spring break begins on Good Friday. And, of course, next week we, of course, won't have any lectures. So anyway, that's it for today. I'll see y'all, of course, later in the week. So y'all take care and have a great, rest of the week. So y'all take care.